This table tells me that a non-professional, ideologically explicit group runs radio pop, that the station broadcasts more music than speech, and that it accepts commercials. It also tells me that the presence of commercials and the abundant music content are not necessarily in contrast with the station's ideology, since we find 2 radio stations with similar characteristics, and only one ideological station that broadcasts more speech than music. On the other hand, the presence of commercials and abundant music characterize all non-ideological stations. And so on. This table is purely hypothetical and considers only a few parameters and a few stations. Therefore, it does not allow us to draw reliable statistical conclusions, and it is only a suggested starting point. And how then do we obtain this data? We can imagine 3 sources: official records, manager statements, and listening protocols that we will establish below. Official records, these always provide the most dependable information, but few exist for independent radio stations. I might first look for an organization's registration documents at the local public safety authority. I might also find the organization's constitutive act or a similar document at the local notary, although these documents may not be publicly accessible. In the future, more precise regulation may facilitate more accessible data, but for now this is the extent of what I can expect to find. However, consider that the name of the station, the broadcasting frequency, and the hours of operation are among the official data. A thesis that provided at least these 3 elements for each station would already be a useful contribution. Manager's statements, we can interview each station's manager. Their words constitute objective data, provided that the interview transcriptions are accurate and that we use homogeneous criteria for conducting the interviews. We must devise a single questionnaire, so that all managers respond to the questions that we deem important, and so that the refusal to answer a question becomes a matter of record. The questionnaire need not necessarily be black and white, requiring only answers of yes or no. If each station manager releases a statement of intent, these statements together could constitute a useful document. Let us clarify the notion of objective data in this case. If the director of a particular station states, "We have no political agenda, and we do not accept outside financing," this may or may not be true. However, the fact that that radio station publicly presents itself in that light is an objective piece of information. Additionally, we may refute this statement based on our critical analysis of the contents of the station's broadcasts, and this brings us to the 3rd source of information. Listening protocols. This aspect of the thesis will determine the difference between rigorous and amateurish work. Totherlei investigatati activitio fan independent radio station, we must listen hour after hour for a few days or a week, and devise a sort of program guide that indicates what content is broadcast at what time, the length of each program, and the ratio of music to talk. If there are debates, the schedule should indicate the topics, participants, and so on. You will not be able to present all of the data you have collected, but you can include meaningful examples that define the artistic, linguistic, and ideological profile of the station you are scrutinizing. It may help to consult the models for radio and TV listening protocols developed over some years by the ARCI Bologna, in which listeners determine the duration of news presentation, the recurrence of certain terms, and so on. Once you have completed this investigation for various radio stations, you could compare your data. For example, you could compare the manner in which 2 or more radio stations introduced the same song or presented a recent event. You could also compare state-owned radio shows to those of independent stations, noting differences in the ratios of music to speech, news to entertainment, programs to commercials, classical to pop music, Italian to foreign music, traditional pop music to youth-oriented pop music, and so on. With a tape recorder and pencil in hand, you will be able to draw many more conclusions through systematic listening than from your interviews with station managers. Sometimes even a simple comparison of commercial sponsors can clarify the obscure financing sources of a given station. The only condition is that you must not follow impressions or make imprudent conclusions such as, at noon a particular radio station broadcast pop music and a Pan-American commercial, so the station must be pro-American. You must also consider what the station broadcast at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. If you are investigating many stations, your listening protocol should take one of the following two approaches. The first is to listen to all the stations simultaneously for 1 week. You can do this by organizing a group of researchers, each one listening to a different station simultaneously. This is the most rigorous solution because you will be able to compare the various radio stations during the same period. Your other choice is to listen to the stations sequentially, 1 station per week. This will require hard work, and you must proceed directly from one station to the next so that the listening period is consistent. The total listening time for all stations should not exceed 6 months or a year at most, since changes are fast and frequent in this sector, and since it would make no sense to compare the programs of Radio Beta in January with those of Radio Aurora in August. When you have compiled the data from the 3 sources outlined above, there is still much left to do. For example, you can do the following. Establish the size of each station's audience. Unfortunately, there are no official ratings data, and you cannot trust the station manager's figures. The only alternative is a random sample telephone survey in which you ask participants to which stations they listen. This is the method followed by RAI, Italy's national broadcasting company, but it requires an organization that is both specialized and expensive. This is a good example of the difficult high-involved scientific treatment of a contemporary, topical phenomenon. You cannot rely on personal impressions and conclude, for example, that the majority of listeners choose Radio Delta simply because this station is popular among 4 or 5 of your friends. Search newspapers and magazines for mentions of the stations you are scrutinizing. Record any opinions of the stations that you find, and describe any controversies. Record the specific laws relevant to the station's operations, and explain how various stations follow or elude them. Describe the legal issues that arise. Document the relevant positions of the political parties on the stations you are scrutinizing, and on free radio stations in general. Attempt to establish comparative tables of commercial fees. The managers may not disclose these, or they may provide erroneous data, but you may be able to gather the data elsewhere. For example, if Radio Delta broadcasts advertisements for a particular restaurant, you may be able to solicit data from the restaurant owner. Record specifically how different radio stations cover a specific event. Analyze the linguistic style of the broadcasters. Analyze the influence that free radio programs have had on certain public radio programs. Compare the nature of the programming, the linguistic usage, etc. Thoroughly collect and catalog the opinions that jurists, political leaders, and other public figures express about the stations you are scrutinizing. Collect the existing bibliography on the subject of free radio stations. Collect everything from books and journal articles on analogous experiments in other countries to the articles in the most remote local newspapers or smallest Italian magazines, so that you assemble the most complete bibliography possible. Let it be clear that you do not have to complete all of these things. Even one of them, if done correctly and exhaustively, can constitute the subject of a thesis. Nor is this the only work to be done. I have only presented these examples to show how, even on a topic as unscholarly and devoid of critical literature as this one, a student can write a scientific work that is useful to others, that can be inserted into broader research, that is indispensable to anyone wishing to investigate the subject. And that is free of subjectivity, random observations, and imprudent conclusions. As we have established, the dichotomy between a scientific and a political thesis is false. It is equally scientific to write a thesis on the doctrine of ideas in Plato and on the politics of Lauda Continua from 1974 to 1976. If you intend to do rigorous work, think hard before choosing the second topic, for it is undoubtedly more difficult. It will require superior research skills and scholarly maturity. If nothing else, you will not have a library on which to rely, but instead must effectively create your own. In any case, we have seen that a student can write scientifically on a subject that others would judge as purely journalistic, just as a student can write a journalistic thesis on a topic that most would qualify as scientific, at least from its title. 2.7. How to avoid being exploited by your advisor. As I've mentioned earlier, often a student chooses a topic based on his own interests, but other times a student wishes to work with a particular professor who suggests a topic to the student. Professors tend to follow two different criteria when suggesting a topic. A professor can recommend a familiar topic on which he can easily advise the student, or a professor can recommend an unfamiliar topic on which he would like to know more. Contrary as it may seem, the second criterion is the more honest and generous. The professor believes that his ability to effectively judge and assist the candidate will require him to devote himself to something new, and thus the professor will expand his horizons. When the professor chooses this second path, it is because he trusts the candidate, and he usually tells the candidate explicitly that the topic is new and interesting to him. Even though universities currently require professors to advise many students, and therefore incline professors to cater to students' interests, some professors still refuse to advise a thesis on a banal topic. There are also specific cases in which a professor is conducting a wide-ranging research project that requires vast amounts of data, and he decides to engage graduating students as members of a team. In other words, he orients the student's work in a specific direction for a certain number of years. He will assign topics that work together to establish a complete picture of his research question. This approach is not only legitimate but also scientifically useful, as each thesis contributes to a larger project that is more important for the collective interest. This approach is also useful from a teaching perspective, because each candidate will benefit from the advice of a professor who is well informed on the question, and each student can use as background and comparative material the theses that other students have already written on related topics. If the candidate does good work, he can hope to publish the results, at least as part of a larger collective work. However, this approach does pose some possible risks. 1. The professor is absorbed by his own topic to such an extent that he imposes it on a candidate who has no interest in the subject. The student becomes a lackey who wearily gathers material for others to interpret. Although the student will have written a modest thesis, he risks not being credited for his work. When the professor writes the final research project, he will perhaps fish out some parts of the student's work from the material he has gathered, but he may use them without citing the student, if only because the student's specific contribution to the final product is difficult to delineate. 2. The professor is dishonest, requires the student to work on his project, approves the thesis, and then unscrupulously uses the work as if it were his own. Sometimes this dishonesty is almost in good faith. The professor may have followed the thesis with passion and suggested many ideas, but over time he loses the ability to distinguish his students' ideas from his own, in the same way that, after a passionate group discussion on a certain topic, we are unable to discern the ideas we introduced from those inspired by others. How can you avoid these risks? Before approaching the professor, you should assess the professor's honesty from the opinions of friends and the experiences of graduates whom the professor advised. You should read his books, and pay particular attention to citations of his collaborators. This investigation will take you so far, but you must also intuitively feel some sense of trust and respect toward the professor. On the other hand, you should not become so paranoid that you believe you have been plagiarized every time a professor or another student addresses a topic related to your thesis. For example, if you did a thesis on the relationship of Darwinism and Lamarckism, your research would show that many scholars have treated the same topic and have shared many common ideas. Therefore, you should not feel like a defrauded genius if the professor, one of his teaching assistants, or one of your classmates writes on the same topic. The actual theft of scientific work means something different altogether, using specific data from your experiments, appropriating your original transcriptions of rare manuscripts, using statistical data that you were the first to collect, or using your original translations of texts that were either never translated or translated differently by others. These constitute theft only if you have not been cited as a source, because once you publish your thesis, others have the right to cite it. So, without slipping into paranoia, consider your willingness to join a collective project, and consider whether the risks are worth it. 3. Conducting research. 3.1. The availability of primary and secondary sources. 3.1.1 What are the sources of a scientific work? A thesis studies an object by making use of specific instruments. Often the object is a book and the instruments are other books. For a thesis on Adam Smith's economic thought, the object is Adam Smith's bibliography, and the instruments are other books on Adam Smith. In this case, we can say that Adam Smith's writings constitute the primary sources and the writings about Adam Smith are the secondary sources or the critical literature. Naturally, if the topic were the sources of Adam Smith's economic thought, the primary sources would then be the books or other writings that inspired Adam Smith. Certainly historical events may also have inspired Adam Smith's work, but these events are nevertheless accessible to us in the form of written material, that is, in the form of other texts. But there are also cases in which the object is a real phenomenon. This would be true for a thesis on the internal migrations of Italians in the 20th century, the behavior of a group of handicapped children, or an audience's opinion of a current TV program. In these cases, primary sources may not yet exist in an organized written form. Instead, you must gather and create our primary documents, including statistical data, interview transcriptions, and sometimes photographs or even audiovisual documents. The critical literature in these cases will not differ greatly from that of our thesis on Adam Smith, although it may consist of newspaper articles and other kinds of documents, instead of books and journal articles. You must be able to clearly distinguish primary sources from critical literature. The critical literature often reproduces quotes from primary sources, but, as we will see in the next paragraph, these are indirect sources. Moreover, a student conducting hasty and disorderly research can easily mistake the arguments contained in primary sources with those of the critical literature. For example, if I am writing a thesis on Adam Smith's economic thought and I notice that I am dwelling on a certain author's interpretations more than my own direct reading of Smith, I must either return to thesaurus or change my topic to the interpretations of Adam Smith in contemporary English liberal thought. The latter topic will not exempt me from understanding Smith's work, but my primary interest will be the interpretations of Smith's work by others. Obviously, an in-depth study of Smith's critics will require a comparison of their work to the original text. However, there could be a case in which the original object matters little to me. Suppose I begin a thesis on traditional Japanese Zen philosophy. Clearly, I must be able to read Japanese, and I cannot trust the few available Western translations. Now suppose that, in examining the critical literature, I become interested in how certain literary and artistic avant-garde movements in the United States made use of Zen in the 50s. At this point, I am no longer interested in understanding the meaning of Zen thought with absolute theological and philological accuracy. Instead, I am now interested in how original Oriental ideas have become elements of a Western artistic ideology. I will change my Tepicto Zen principle since San Francisco Renaissance of the 1950s, and my primary sources will become the texts of Kerouac, Ginsberg, Ferlinghetti, and so on. As for my understanding of original Zen philosophy, some reliable critical works and good translations will now suffice. Naturally, this approach assumes that I do not wish to demonstrate that the Californians misinterpreted the original Zen thought, which would require me to make comparisons with the Japanese originals. But because the Californians loosely based their work on Western translations, I am more interested in their interpretations than in the original philosophy. This example also illustrates that I should promptly define the true object of my thesis so that I can determine the availability of my sources from the outset. In Section 3. 2.4, I will demonstrate how to start a thesis from scratch with no preconceived bibliography, and how to obtain all the sources I need from a single, small library. Although this procedure is possible, the situation will rarely occur because realistically I would not choose a topic unless I already knew where I could find the sources, whether they were easily accessible, and whether I was capable of fully understanding them. It would be imprudent of me to accept a thesis on a particular set of James Joyce's manuscripts without knowing Thackeray Sidith University of Buffalo, or knowing full well that I would never be able to travel to New York. It would be equally unwise to enthusiastically accept a topic on a private collection of documents belonging to a family that is overly protective of them and that reveals them only to renowned scholars. And I should not accept a topic that deals with medieval manuscripts, no matter how accessible they are, if I lack the proper training needed to read them. More realistically, I might agree to study an author only to learn that his original texts are very rare, and that I must travel like a maniac from library to library, or even from country to country. Or I may rely on the fact that microfilms of his complete oeuvre are readily available, forgetting that my department does not own the apparatus to read them, or that I suffer from conjunctivitis and cannot endure such exhausting work. And it would be quite useless for me, if I were studying film at an Italian university, to plan a thesis on a minor work of a director from the 1920s, if I then discovered that the only copy of this work resides in the Library of Congress in Washington. Once the problem of the primary sources is resolved, the same questions arise for the critical literature. I could choose a thesis on a minor 18th century author because the first edition of his work coincidentally resides in my city's library, but I may then learn that the best critical works on my author are not available at any library to which I have access, and are very expensive to purchase. You cannot avoid this problem by deciding to work only on the sources to which you have access. You must read all of the critical literature, or at least all of it that matters, and you must access the sources directly. Otherwise, you should choose another topic according to the criteria described in Chapter 2, rather than irresponsibly complete a thesis with unforgivable omissions. Let us look at some concrete examples from thesis defenses that I have recently attended. In each of these, the authors precisely identified sources that were unquestionably within their range of expertise, verified the availability of these sources, and used them effectively. The first thesis was on the clerical moderate experiencing City Hall administration of Medina. As the title indicates, the candidate had precisely defined the scope of the project. The candidate was from Medina, so he could work locally. He discriminated between a general bibliography and bibliography specifically on the subject of Medina. He may have traveled to other cities for the former, and I assume he was able to work in the city libraries of Medina on the latter. He also divided the primary sources into archival sources and journalistic sources, the latter including relevant articles from contemporary newspapers. The second thesis was on the scholastic policy of the Italian Communist Party from the formation of the center-left to the student protests. Here too, the students specified the topic with precision and, I would say, prudence, because conducting research on the period after 1968 would have been difficult due to the sheer quantity of sources. the student judiciously chose to focus on the period before 1968, limiting his sources to the official press of the Communist Party, the parliamentary acts, the party's archives, and the general press. I have to imagine that, no matter how precisely the student researched the general press, some information must have slipped through the cracks due to the amount of coverage involved. Nevertheless, the general press was unquestionably a valid secondary source of opinions and criticisms. As for the other sources, the official declarations were sufficient to define the Communist Party's scholastic policy. Had the thesis dealt with the scholastic policy of the Christian Democracy, a party in the government coalition, this would have been a very different story, and the research would surely have assumed dramatic proportions. On one hand there would have been the official statements, on the other the actual governmental acts that may have contradicted these statements. Take also into account that, if the period had extended beyond 1968, the student would have had to include, among the source of official opinions, all the publications of the extra-parliamentary movements that began to proliferate after that period. Once again, the research would have been far more difficult. Finally, I imagine that the candidate had the opportunity to work in Rome, or he was able to have the required material photocopied and sent to him. The third thesis dealt with medieval history and was on a seemingly difficult topic. It examined the vicissitudes of the San Zeno Abbey's estate in Verona during the High Middle Ages. The heart of the work consisted of a transcription, previously never attempted, of certain folios from the San Zeno Abbey's registry in the 13th century. Naturally, the project required some knowledge of paleography, but once the candidate acquired this technique, he only needed to diligently execute the transcription and comment on the results. Nevertheless, the thesis included a bibliography of 30 titles, a sign that the student had historically contextualized the specific problem on the basis of previous literature. I assumed that the candidate was from Verona and had chosen a project that did not involve much travel. For thesis swastville contemporary drama performances in Trentino. The candidate, who lived in that region of Italy, knew that there had been a limited number of performances, and he reconstructed them by consulting newspapers, city archives, and statistical surveys on the audience's frequency. The fifth thesis, Aspects of Cultural Policy in the City of Budrio with particular reference to the city library's activity, was similar. These are two examples of projects whose sources are easily available, but that are nevertheless useful because they require a compilation of statistical sociological documentation that will serve future researchers. A sixth thesis required more time and effort than the others. It illustrates how a student can treat with scientific rigor a topic that at first seems appropriate only for an honest literature survey. The title was The Question of the Actor in Adolphe Appiah's oeuvre. Appiah is a well-known Swiss author and the subject of abundant historical and theoretical theater studies that, it would seem, have exhausted all there is to say about him. But the candidate painstakingly researched the Swiss archives, along with countless libraries, and explored each and every place where Appiah had worked. The student was able to compile an exhaustive bibliography of works on the author, along with the author's own writings, including minor articles that had been forgotten shortly after their original publication. This gave the thesis a breadth and precision that, according to the advisor, qualified it as a definitive contribution. The student thus went beyond the literature survey by making these obscure sources accessible. 3.1.2 Direct and Indirect Sources. Regarding books, a direct source is an original edition or a critical edition of the work in question. A translation is not a direct source, it is instead a prosthetic like dentures or a pair of glasses. It is a means by which I gain limited access to something that lies outside my range. An anthology is not a direct source, it is a stew of sources, useful only for a first approach to the topic. If I write a thesis on a particular author, my goal is to see in him what others have not, and an anthology only provides someone else's view. The critical works of other authors, no matter how rich with quotations, are not direct sources. At best, they are indirect sources. Indirect sources can take many forms. If the subject of my thesis is the Italian communist politician Palmiro Togliatti, the parliamentary speeches published by the newspaper Unita constitute an indirect source, because there is no assurance that the newspaper has not made edits or mistakes. Instead, the parliamentary acts themselves constitute a direct source. If I could locate an actual text written by Togliatti himself, I would have the ultimate direct source. If I want to study the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America, the only direct source is the original document. However, a good photocopy can also be considered a direct source. I can also use as a direct source the critical edition by a historiographer of undisputed rigor, if I define undisputed to mean that his edition has never been challenged by other critical works. Clearly, the concepts of direct and indirect sources depend on my perspective and the approach that I take for my thesis. If I wish to discuss the political meaning of Declaration of Independence in my thesis, a good critical edition will be more than adequate. If I want to write a thesis on the narrative structures in The Betrothed, any edition of Alessandro Manzoni's novel will suffice. Instead, my thesis might be called Manzoni's Linguistic Transformation from Milan to Florence. It would explore the novel's linguistic change from the blend of Lombard vernacular and traditional literary language of the 1827 edition to the contemporary Florentine of the 1840 edition. In this case, my thesis would require a good critical edition of each version of the novel. Let us then say that my sources should always be direct, within the limits set by the object of my research. The only absolute rule is that I should not quote my author through another quote. In theory, a rigorous scientific work should never quote from any quote, even if the material that I wish to quote is from someone other than the object of my thesis. Nevertheless, there are reasonable exceptions, especially for a thesis. For example, if you choose the question of the transcendental nature of beauty in Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologiae, your primary source will be Thomas Aquinas's Summa. Let us say that Marietti's currently available edition is sufficient, unless you suspect that it betrays the original, in which case you must return to other editions. You will soon discover that Aquinas also addresses the transcendental nature of beauty in his commentary to Pseudo-Dionysius's De Divinis Nominibus, and you must address this work as well, despite your thesis's restrictive title. Finally, you will discover that Aquinas's work on this theme drew from an entire religious tradition, and that researching all of the original sources would take a scholar his entire career. You will also discover that such a work already exists, and that its author is Dom Henry Pouillon who, in this vast work of his, quotes large passages from all the authors who commented on Pseudo-Dionysius and illuminates the relationships, origins, and contradictions of these commentaries. Within the scope of your thesis, you can certainly use the material Pouillon gathered each time you refer to Alexander of Hales or Hilduin. If you come to realize that Alexander of Hales' text becomes essential for the development of your argument, then you can consult the Quaracci edition of the direct text, but if you only need to refer to a short quote, it will suffice to declare that you found the source through Pouillon. Nobody will fault you because Pouillon is a rigorous scholar, and because the text you quoted indirectly through him was not central to your thesis. What you should never do is quote from an indirect source pretending that you have read the original. This is not just a matter of professional ethics. Imagine if someone asked how you were able to read a certain manuscript directly when it is common knowledge that it was destroyed in 1944. This being said, you need not get caught up in direct source neurosis. The fact that Napoleon died on May 5, 1821 is common knowledge, usually acquired through indirect sources, such as history books written on the basis of other history books. If you wish to study the precise date of Napoleon's death, you would need to locate original documentation. But if you wish to address the influence of Napoleon's death on the psychology of European liberal youth, you can trust the date that appears in any history book. After you declare that you are citing an indirect source in your thesis, it may be prudent to check other indirect sources to determine the accuracy of a certain quote, or the reference to a certain fact or opinion. If you find inconsistencies that raise suspicion, you can either choose not to quote the data, or search for the direct source. For example, since we have already mentioned St. Thomas's aesthetic thought, let us note that a number of recent texts that discuss this topic assume that St. Thomas said the following, pulchrum est id quod visum placet. Since I wrote my own thesis on this topic, I consulted the original texts and noticed that St. Thomas had never said that. Instead, he said, pulchra dicunterque visa placent, and I will not go into the details of why the two formulations can lead to very different interpretations. What had happened? Many years ago the philosopher Jacques Maritain had proposed the first formulation, thinking he was faithfully summarizing St. Thomas's thought. Since then, other scholars have referred to Maritain's formulation, without bothering to check the original. The same issue arises in regard to bibliographical entries. In a rush, you may decide to include in your bibliography sources you have not read. You may discuss these works in footnotes, or what's worse, in the body of the text, all along drawing from information that you gathered indirectly. For example, you may find yourself writing a thesis on the Baroque, having read Luciano Anceschi's article Boccone tra Rinascimento e Barocco, and De Boccone Cant. You cite this article in a note and then, to make a good impression, you add the following comment, for other acute and stimulating observations on the same topic cid, l'estetica di Boccone, and l'estetica dell'empirismo inglese. However, since you have not actually read L'Estetica di Boccone, and you are simply mentioning a text that you saw referenced in a note, you will make a terrible impression when a professor points out that the two articles are one and the same. L'Estetica di Boccone having been published 13 years before Boccone tra Rinascimento e Barocco in a more limited edition. These observations are also valid if the object of your thesis is a current event rather than a series of texts. If I want to address the reactions of farmers from Romagna to a particular set of TV news programs, a primary source will be the survey I conduct in the field, interviewing a reliable and adequate sample of farmers according to defined rules. If not this, I should at least use as my primary source a recent analogous survey published by a reliable source. Clearly, I would be at fault if I relied on 10-year-old research, if nothing else because both the farmers and the TV news programs have changed significantly over the past decade. However, this research might be appropriate for a thesis titled Studies on the Relationship Between the Audience and Television in the 60s. 3.2 Bibliographical Research 3.2.1 How to use the library. How should a student conduct preliminary research in the library? If he already has a reliable bibliography, he can obviously search the author catalog to discover what a particular library has to offer. If the library lacks some of the titles in his bibliography, he can search another library, and so on. But this method assumes that he already has a bibliography, and that he is able to access a series of libraries, maybe one in Rome and another in London. But as we have previously discussed, readers of this book may not have such opportunities. Nor do many professional scholars. Furthermore, although we sometimes go to the library to find a book that we already know exists, we often go to the library to find out if a book exists, or to discover books about which we have no previous knowledge. In other words, we often go to the library to compile a bibliography, and this means searching for sources that we do not yet know exist. A good researcher can enter a library without having the faintest idea about scholarship on a particular topic, and exit knowing more about it, if only a little more. The catalog. The library offers some resources that allow us to find relevant sources about which we have no previous knowledge. Naturally, the first is called the subject catalog. Of course, there is also an alphabetically arranged author catalog that is useful to those who already know what they want, but the subject catalog is for those who do not yet know. Here, a good library tells me everything that I can find in its stacks, for example, on the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But querying the subject catalog requires some skill. Clearly, we cannot find the entry Fall of the Roman Empire under the letter F, unless we are dealing with a library with a very sophisticated indexing system. We will have to look under Roman Empire, and then under Rome, and then under History. And if we have retained some preliminary knowledge from primary school, we will have the foresight to consult Romulus Augustulus or Augustulus, Orestes, Odoacer, Barbarians, and Roman Barbarian. Our problems do not end there. In many libraries there are 2 author catalogs and 2 subject catalogs, old ones that stop at a certain date, and the new ones that are works in progress and that will absorb the old ones only at some future date. And we will not necessarily find information on the fall of the Roman Empire in the old catalog simply because that event took place centuries ago. In fact, there could be recent books on the subject that are only indexed in the new catalog. Also, in certain libraries there are separate catalogs for different collections. In other libraries, subjects and authors are indexed together. There also may be separate catalogs for books and journals, divided by subject and author, and we may even encounter a library that stores books on the first floor and journals on the second. Consequently, we must study the system used by the library in which we are working and make our decisions accordingly. Also, some intuition is usually necessary. For example, if the older of the 2 catalogs is very old, and I am researching the Greek region of Laconia, I should also search for the obsolete spelling Lacedaemonia, because an overly diligent librarian may have indexed this entry separately. Also note that the author catalog is always more reliable than the subject catalog because the act of compiling it does not depend on the librarian's interpretation, as is the case with the subject catalog. In fact, if the library has a book by John Smith, you will invariably find Smith, John under S in the author catalog. But if John Smith has written an article on the role of Odoacer in the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the advent of the Roman barbarian Regna, the librarian may have recorded it under the subject History or Odoacer, but not necessarily under the entry Western Roman Empire where you are currently looking. Finally, the author and subject catalogs simply may not provide the information you require, and in this case you must settle for a more elementary approach. In every library there is a reference section that contains a collection of encyclopedias, general histories, and bibliographical indexes. If you are looking for works on the Western Roman Empire, you can search the subject of Roman history, compile a basic bibliography starting from the reference works you find, and then search for the authors in the author catalog. Bibliographical indexes. These are the safest resources for a student who already has clearly defined ideas about a topic. For some disciplines there are famous manuals where the student can find all the necessary bibliographical information. For other disciplines there are periodical indexes that contain updates in each issue, and even journals dedicated solely to a subject's bibliography. For others still, there are journals that include an appendix in every issue that documents the most recent publications in the field. Bibliographical indexes are essential supplements to catalog research, as long as they are updated. In fact, some libraries may have an extensive collection of the oldest publications, but little or no updated work. Or they may offer histories or manuals of the discipline in question that were published in 1960 and that provide useful bibliographical information, but will not tell you if an interesting work was published in 1975. An updated bibliographical index gives you exactly this kind of information on the latest contributions to a particular field. The most convenient way to learn about bibliographical indexes is to ask your advisor. You can also ask the librarian who can direct you to the room or the section of the stacks that contains the bibliographical indexes. Again here, the issue changes from discipline to discipline, so I cannot offer further advice. The librarian. You must overcome any shyness and have a conversation with the librarian because he can offer you reliable advice that will save you much time. You must consider that the librarian is happy when he can demonstrate two things: the quality of his memory and erudition and the richness of his library, especially if it is small. The more isolated and disregarded the library, the more the librarian is consumed with sorrow for its underestimation. A person who asks for help makes the librarian happy. Although you must rely on the librarian's assistance, you should not trust him blindly. Listen to his advice, but then search deeply and independently. The librarian is not an expert on every subject, and he is also unaware of the particular perspective you wish to adopt for your research. He may deem fundamental a particular book that you end up barely consulting, and may disregard another that you find very useful. Additionally, there is no such thing as a predetermined hierarchy of useful and important works. An idea contained almost by mistake on a page of an otherwise useless book may prove decisive for your research. You must discover this page on your own, with your own intuition and a little luck, and without anybody serving it to you on a silver platter. Union catalogs, electronic catalogs, and interlibrary loan. Many libraries publish updated inventories of their holdings. Therefore, in some libraries it is possible to consult catalogs that list the holdings of other national and foreign libraries, at least for some particular disciplines. Asking for information from the librarian is also useful in this case. There are certain specialized libraries linked via computer to a central memory that can quickly inform you whether and where you can find a certain book. For example, the Venice Biennale instituted the historical archives of contemporary arts that are linked via computer to the National Central Library's archive in Rome. You can search the catalog by author, title, subject, series, publisher, year of publication, etc. If you have located a book in a national or foreign library, keep in mind that a library usually has an interlibrary loan service that may be national or international. It may take some time to get what you need, but it is worth trying if you need sources that are difficult to find. Even if there is such a service, the library that has the book may not lend it, as some libraries will only lend duplicate copies. Here again, you should consult your advisor about all the possibilities of locating needed sources. In any case, remember that the services we need often do exist, but they only work if they are patronized often. Also remember that many libraries keep a list of their new arrivals, their most recent acquisitions that have not yet been indexed. Finally, do not forget that, if you are working rigorously on a project that interests your advisor, you may be able to convince your institution to purchase some important texts that you cannot obtain otherwise. 3.2.2 Managing your sources with the bibliographical index card file. Naturally, to compile a basic bibliography you must consult many books. Many librarians will only lend 1 or 2 books at a time, are slow to find each book for you, and will grumble if you quickly return for new books. This is why you should not try to immediately read every book you find, but rather compile a basic bibliography of sources pertaining to your topic. A preliminary inspection of the catalogs allows you to prepare a list of books that you can then begin borrowing. However, the list you derive from the catalogs does not say much about each book's contents, and it is sometimes difficult to determine which books you should borrow first. For this reason, in addition to consulting the catalogs in the reference room, you should preliminarily inspect each book. When you find a chapter and its accompanying bibliography that pertain to your topic, you can skim the chapter, but be sure to copy all of that chapter's bibliography. Together with the chapter that you have skimmed, its bibliography will show which books the author considers fundamental among those he cites, and you can begin by borrowing those. Additionally, if you cross-check the bibliographies with some reference works, you will determine which books are cited most often, and you can begin to establish a first hierarchy of sources for your topic. This hierarchy may change as you proceed in your work, but for now it constitutes a starting point. Now, you may object to the idea of copying the entire bibliography from 10 different sources. In fact, your research may lead you to as many as a few hundred books, even though your cross-check will eliminate doubles. Fortunately, these days every legitimate library has a copy machine, and each copy costs about a dime. A specific bibliography contained in a reference work, except in very rare cases, occupies only a few pages. With a few dollars you can photocopy a series of bibliographies that you can easily organize once you return home. Once you have finished the bibliography, you can return to the library to determine which sources are actually available. At this point, it will be useful to begin to document your bibliography. You might at first be tempted to record the titles in a notebook as you encounter them. Later, after determining if the titles are available in the library, you might finish each notebook entry by writing the call number near the title. The problem with this approach is that it becomes more difficult to locate the titles in your notebook as your bibliography grows. Also consider that your preliminary research might generate a bibliography of hundreds of titles, even if only some of them will ultimately be useful to your thesis. A better system is to create a bibliographical index card for each book. On each card you can record an abbreviation that signifies the library where the book is available, as well as the call number of the book. A single card might contain manila abbreviation and call numbers, indicating that the book is widely available in different locations. You can then file your cards in a small index card box. You can purchase a small box of this kind inexpensively from the stationer, or you can make one yourself. You can fit 100 or 200 index cards into one small box, and you can take the box with you to the library. This is your bibliography file, and if your documentation is well organized, it will give you a clear picture of the sources you have found, and those you still need to locate. Additionally, everything will be in alphabetical order and easy to find. If you wish, you could standardize your index cards so that the call number is in the top right and a conventional abbreviation in the top left that indicates if the book is a good general reference, a source for a specific chapter, and so on. Naturally, if you do not have the patience to organize and use this system, you can resort to using a notebook. But the disadvantages are evident. You may note the A authors on the first page and the B authors on the second, but your first page may fill up before you find an article by Federico Azzamonti or John Saverio Abadi. You are better off buying an address book, in which you might not record a body before Azzamonti if you found the latter author first, but at least they will both be in the 4 pages dedicated to the letter A. The virtue of the index card system is that you can easily reorganize the cards as the bibliography grows and changes, and your cards will always be in true alphabetical order. You may also thank yourself for using this system when you need to use your bibliography file to pursue a related project later, and you will have an organized system to lend to someone who is working on a similar topic. In Chapter 4 we will talk about some other types of index card files, the readings file, the idea file, and the quote file, and we will address the applications of each. For now, a brief introduction to the readings file and some preliminary remarks about the difference between it and the bibliography file will suffice. Your readings file should contain index cards dedicated only to the books that you have actually read. Here you can document summaries, assessments, and quotes, although you may wish to dedicate an entire file exclusively to quotations. In short, on each card in your readings file you can document everything you will need when you actually begin writing your thesis and your final bibliography, bearing in mind that the book may not be available to you at that time. Unlike your bibliography file, you do not have to carry your readings file with you on every trip to the library. Also, your readings file may require larger sheets of paper, although a system of index cards is always the most manageable. Unlike the readings file, the bibliography file must also contain index cards for all the books you must find, not only for the ones you have already located and read. It would even be possible for a bibliography file to contain 10,000 titles and a readings file a mere 10, although this would clearly illustrate a thesis that began extraordinarily well but ended very badly. In any case, you should take your bibliography file with you every time you go to a library. Its index cards contain only a book's essential information and the libraries and call numbers under which the book can be found. At most, you can annotate very important according to author X, absolutely must find, so on. So says this is a worthless work, or even by this. But any further annotation should be left for the readings file. An entry in the readings file can absorb multiple index cards, whereas each item in the bibliography file comprises one and only one index card. Finally, construct your bibliography file with care. Do not hastily scribble down titles in stenographic characters, a process prone to error. The better you make your bibliography file, the easier it will be to preserve and supplement for future research. It will also be more valuable to lend or even sell, and therefore it is worth ensuring that it is legible and well organized. Most importantly, the bibliography file will provide the foundation for the final bibliography, provided that it contains thorough documentation on the books you have found, read, and archived in the readings file. For this reason, in the following section I will provide documentation guidelines, the instructions to correctly document your sources so that others can easily find them. Use these guidelines for each of the following. 1. The bibliography file. 2. The readings file. 3. References in notes. 4. The final bibliography. Although I will return to these guidelines in the chapters in which I discuss these 4 different stages in preparing the thesis, I will establish them definitively in the following section. These guidelines are of the utmost importance, and you must have the patience to become familiar with them. You will realize that they are primarily functional guidelines because they allow you and your reader to identify the exact book to which you are referring. But they are also rules, so to speak, of erudite etiquette. Their observance reveals a scholar who is familiar with the discipline, and their violation betrays the academic parvenu, and sometimes casts a shadow of discredit on an otherwise rigorous work. These rules of etiquette matter, and they should not be disparaged as a formalist's weakness. There is a similar dynamic in sports, stamp collecting, billiards, and political life. If a participant misuses key expressions, he raises suspicion, like an outsider who is not one of us. Thus, you must heed the rules of the company you want to join. As the Italian proverb goes, if in company you don't pee, a spy or a thief you may be. And if you wish to violate or oppose rules, you must first know them well enough to expose their inconsistencies or repressive functions. So, for example, before you can declare that it is unnecessary to italicize a book's title, you must first know that this is in fact the convention, and you must understand the reasons for this convention. 3.2.3 Documentation Guidelines. Books. Here is an example of an incorrect reference. Wilson, J. Philosophy and Religion. Oxford, 1961. This reference is incorrect for the following reasons. 1. It provides only the initial of the author's first name. The first initial is not enough, first of all, because readers may want to know the full name, and second of all, because there can be 2 authors with the same last name and first initial. If I read that the author of the book Logic and the Art of Memory, The Quest for a Universal Language is P. Rossi, I cannot determine whether the author is the philosopher Paolo Rossi of the University of Florence or the philosopher Pietro Rossi of the University of Turin. And who is J. Cohen? Is he the French critic and aesthetician Jean Cohen or the English philosopher Jonathan Cohen? 2. The book title is in quotation marks. However you choose to format a reference, never use quotation marks for book titles, because this is the method used almost universally to refer to journal articles or book chapters. Also, in the title in question the word religion should also be capitalized. English titles capitalize nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs, but not articles, particles, and prepositions. 3. It is hideous to say where the book has been published and not by whom. Suppose you find an Italian book that seems important and that you would like to purchase, but the only publication information in the reference is Milan, 1975. Which press published this book? Mondadori, Rizzoli, Risconi, Bompiani, Feltrinelli, or Velarde? How can the bookseller help you? And if you find Paris, 1976, to whom do you address your letter of inquiry? And if the book has been published in Cambridge, which Cambridge is it? The one in England or the one in the United States? In fact, many important authors cite books this way. Know that, except when they are writing an encyclopedia entry, these authors are snobs who despise their audience. Reference eslocathesir sufficient only in the case of books published before 1900. That you will only find in a library, or in a limited number of antique booksellers. 4. Despite what this reference would lead you to believe, this book was not published in Oxford. As noted on the title page, the book was published by Oxford University Press, and this press has locations in London, New York, and Toronto. What's more, it was printed in Glasgow. The reference should indicate where the book was published, not where it was printed. I once encountered a reference in a thesis for a particular book that included Farigliano, Bompiani. Knowing that Bompiani is in Milan, I turned to the copyright page and learned that by chance the book was printed at a printer located in the town of Farigliano. The person concocting such references gives the impression that he has never seen a book in his life. To be safe, never look for the publishing information only on the title page, but also on the copyright page, where you will find the real place of publication, as well as the date and number of the edition. If you only look briefly on the title page, you may incur other pathetic mistakes, such as leading your readers to believe that the quaint beach town of Cattolica on the Adriatic Sea is the place of publication for a book published by the prestigious Università Cattolica in Milan. It would be as if an Italian student found books published by Yale University Press, Harvard University Press, or Cornell University Press and indicated that they were published in Yale, Harvard, or Cornell. These are of course not names of places, but the proper nouns of those famous private universities, located in the cities of New Haven, Cambridge, and Ithaca respectively. 5. As for the date, it is correct only by chance. The date marked on the title page is not always the actual date of the book's first publication. It can be that of the latest edition. Only on the copyright page will you find the date of the first edition. Sometimes the difference between these dates is very important. Suppose for example that you find the following reference. Searle, J. Speech Acts. Cambridge, 1974. On top of the other inaccuracies, by checking the copyright page you discover that the date of the first edition is 1969. Now, the point of your thesis may be to establish whether Searle talked about these speech acts before or after other authors, and so the date of the first edition is fundamental. Besides, if you thoroughly read the book's preface, you discover that he presented this fundamental thesis as his PhD dissertation in Oxford in 1959, and that during that 10-year period various parts of the book appeared in a number of philosophical journals. And nobody would ever think to cite Herman Melville's 19th-century classic as follows, simply because he is holding a recent edition that was published in Indianapolis. Melville, Herman. Moby Dick, or The Whale. Indianapolis, 1976. Whether you are studying Searle or Melville, you must never spread wrong ideas about an author's work. If you worked on a later, revised, or augmented edition by Melville, Searle, Wilson, you must specify both the date of the first publication and that of the edition you quote. Now that we have seen how not to cite a book, I will show you 5 ways to correctly cite these works by Searle and Wilson. Let it be clear that there are other methods, and that each method could be valid provided it does the following: distinguishes the book from articles or the chapters of other books, indicates unequivocally both the author's name and the title, and indicates the place of publication, the name of the publisher, and the edition. Therefore, each of the following 5 examples works. Each has its pros and cons. However, for a number of reasons that will soon become clear, we will prefer the first example. 1. Searle, John R. Speech Acts, an Essay in the Philosophy of Language. 5th edition, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1974. First published 1969. Wilson, John. Philosophy and Religion, The Logic of Religious Belief. London, Oxford University Press, 1961. 2. Searle, John R. Speech Acts. Wilson, John. Philosophy and Religion. 3. Searle, John R. Speechacts, 5th edition, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1974. First published 1969. Wilson, John, Philosophyandraeligion, London, Oxford University Press, 1961. 4. Searle, John R. Speech Acts. Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1969. Wilson, John. Philosophy and Religion. London, Oxford University Press, 1961. 5. Searle, John R. 1969. Speech Acts, an Essay in the Philosophy of Language. 5th edition, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, 1974. Wilson, John. 1961, Philosophy and Religion, The Logic of Religious Belief. London, Oxford University Press. Naturally, there are also hybrid solutions. For instance, the 4th example could contain the subtitle as do the 1st and 5th. As we shall see, there are even more complex systems that include, for example, the title of the series. In any case, we can consider all 5 of these examples to be valid. For now, let us disregard the 5th, because it applies to a specialized bibliography that we will discuss later when we address the subjects of notes and the final bibliography. The 2nd example is typically American, and it is more common in footnotes than in the final bibliography. The 3rd example, typically German, is nowadays fairly rare, and in my opinion does not offer any advantage. The 4th is also quite popular in the United States, and I find it quite annoying because it does not allow us to immediately distinguish the book's title. The first system tells us all we need to know, and that we are in fact referring to a book and not an article. Journals. Consider these 3 different ways to cite a journal article. Anceschi, Luciano. Orizzonte della Poggia. Il Veri, NS, 1, 6, 21. Anceschi, Luciano. Orizzonte della Poggia. Il Veri, NS, 1, 6, 21. Anceschi, Luciano. Orizzonte della Poggia. In Il Veri, 6, 21. There are other systems also, but let us immediately turn to the 1st and the 3rd examples. The 1st presents the article in quotation marks and the journal in italics. The 3rd presents the article in italics and the journal in quotation marks. Why is the 1st preferable? Because it allows us at a glance to understand that Orizzonte della Poggia is a short text and not a book. As we shall see, journal articles are included in the same category as book chapters and conference proceedings. Clearly, the second example is a variation of the first, but it eliminates the reference to the date of publication and is therefore defective. It would have been better to at least include IL Very 1. You will note that both the first and second examples include the indication N.S. or new series. This designation is quite important because a previous series of IL Very appeared in 1956 with another first issue. If I had to cite a reference from the first issue of Volume 1 of the previous series, I would specify the volume in addition to the issue number, as follows. Gourlier, Claudio. Lapicus D. Dillon Thomas. IL Very 1, Number 1, 39, 46. In addition, note that some journals number the pages progressively over the year. Therefore, if I wanted, for these journals I could omit the issue number and record only the year and the pages. For example, Guglielmi, Guido. Tecnica e Letteratura. Lingua e Style, 1966:323, 340. If I then find this journal in the library, I will realize that page 323 is in the third issue of the first volume. But I do not see why I should subject my reader to this exercise, when it would have been so much more convenient to write Guglielmi, Guido. Tecnica e Letteratura. Lingua e Style 1, Number 3. This reference makes the article easier to find, even though it lacks page numbers. Also, consider that if I wanted to order the journal from the publisher as a back issue, I would care only about the issue number, not the pages. However, I do need to know the first and last pages to determine the length of the article, and for this reason it is recommended to include the page numbers. Guglielmi, Guido. Tecnica e Letteratura. Lingua e Style 1, Number 3, 323, 340. Multiple authors and an editor. Let us move on to the chapters of larger works, be they collections of essays by the same author or miscellaneous volumes. Here is a simple example. Morperto Tagliabue, Guido. Aristotelismo e Barocco. In Retorica e Barocco, Atti del 3 Congresso Internazionale di Studi Umanistici, Venezia, 15-18 Giugno 1954, edition Enrico Castelli, 196 Rome, Bocca, 1955. This reference tells me everything I need to know. First, it tells me that Morperto Tagliabue's text is part of a collection of other texts. Although it is not a book, the number of pages his article occupies tells me that it is quite a substantial study. Second, it tells me that the volume is a collection of conference proceedings by various authors titled Retorica e Barocco. This is important information because I may discover that some bibliographies listed under the heading of convention and conference proceedings. Finally, it tells me that the editor of the collection is Enrico Castelli. This information is also important, not only because some libraries may catalog the volume under his name, but also because bibliographies alphabetize multi-author volumes under the name of the editor. Or editors, as follows. Castelli, Enrico, edition Retorica e Barocco. Rome, Bocca, 1955. These distinctions are important for locating a book in a library catalog or in a bibliography. As we shall see when we conduct an actual experiment of bibliographical research in section 3.2.4, I will find Morperto Tagliabue's essays cited in the Storia della Letteratura Italiana published by Garzanti in the following terms. On this topic see the miscellaneous volume Retorica e Barocco, Atti del 3 Congresso Internazionale di Studi Umanistici, and in particular Morperto Tagliabue's important to say Aristotelismo Barocco. This is a terrible reference because it does not tell us the author's first name. It makes us think that either the conference was in Milan or the publisher is in Milan. It does not indicate the publisher. It does not indicate the length of the essay, and it does not indicate the editor of the volume. Even though the designation of miscellaneous would seem to imply that the volume is a collection of essays from various authors requiring an editor. Shame on us if we wrote such a reference on our bibliographical index card. Instead, we should write our reference so that there is free space for the missing information. More Purgatagliabu G. Aristotelismo Barocco. In Retorica e Barocco, Adi del 3 Congresso Internazionale di Studi Umanistici, edited by Milan. 1955. This way, we can later fill in the blanks with the missing information once we find it in another bibliography, in the library catalog, or on the title page of the book itself. Multiple authors and no editor. Suppose I want to index an essay that appeared in a book written by 4 different authors, none of whom is the editor. For example, let us cite a German book with 4 essays by T. A. van Dyck, Jens Uwe, Janos S. Petafy, and Hannes Reser. In this case, we should note the names of all 4 authors because we must include them in the bibliographical entry. But in a note, we should indicate only the first author followed by et al. Or in others for convenience. T. Van Dyck et al., zur Bestimmung narrativer Strukturen auf der Grundlage von Textgrammatiken, etc. Let us consider the more complex example of the essay Anthropology and Sociology by Del Hymes. This essay appears in the 3rd book of the 12th volume of a multi-author work, in which each volume has a title different from that of the entire work. Cite the essay as follows. Hymes, Del. Anthropology and Sociology. In Current Trends in Linguistics, edition Thomas A. Sebeok, 1445-1475, Vol. 12, Book 3, Linguistics and Adjacent Arts and Sciences. The Hague, Mouton, 1974. If instead we must cite the entire work, the information the reader expects is no longer in which volume Del Hymes's essay resides, but of how many volumes the entire work consists. Sebeok, Thomas A., edition Current Trends in Linguistics. 12 volumes The Hague, Mouton, 1967-1976. When we must cite an essay belonging to a collection of essays by the same author, the reference is similar to that of a multi-author book, except for the fact that we omit the name of the author before the book. Rossi Landi, Ferruccio. Ideologia cum progettazione sociali. In il linguaggio cum lavoro e cum mercato, 193, 224 Milan, Bompiani, 1968. Transactions Martha Adams et al. As Ideology as Social Planning, in Language as Work and Trade, 83, 106. You may have noticed that usually the title of a chapter is cited as being in a given book, while the article of a journal is not in a journal, and the name of the journal directly follows the title of the article. The series. A more perfect reference system might require the series in which a volume appears. I do not consider this an indispensable piece of information, as it is easy enough to find a book if you know its author, title, publisher, and the year of publication. But in some disciplines, the series may guarantee or indicate a specific scientific trend. In this case, the series is noted without quotation marks or parentheses after the book title, and is followed directly by the number of the volume in the series. Rossi Landi, Ferruccio. Il linguaggio cum lavoro e cum mercato. Nuovi saggi italiani 2. Milan, Bompiani, 1968. Anonymous authors and pseudonyms. If you are dealing with an anonymous author, begin the entry with the title and alphabetize the entry accordingly, ignoring any initial article. If the author has a pseudonym, begin the entry with the pseudonym followed by the author's real name. In brackets. After the author's real name, place a question mark if the attribution is still a hypothesis, no matter how reliable the source. If you are dealing with an author whose identity is established by tradition, but whose historicity scholars have recently challenged, record him as pseudo in the following manner. Pseudolonginus. On the sublime. Reprints in collections or anthologies. A work that originally appeared in a journal may have been reprinted in a collection of essays by the same author, or in a popular anthology. If this work is of marginal interest with respect to your thesis topic, you can cite the most convenient source. If instead your thesis specifically addresses the work, then you must cite the first publication for reasons of historical accuracy. Nothing forbids you from using the most accessible edition, but if the anthology or the collection of essays is well prepared, it should contain a reference to the work's first edition. This information should allow you to create references such as this. Fodor, Jerry A., and Gerald J. Katz. The structure of a semantic theory. In the Structure of Language, edition Jerry A. Fodor and Gerald J. Katz, 479, 518. Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Prentice Hall, 1964. Originally published as The Structure of a Semantic Theory. Language 39, 170, 210. When you use the author date system for your bibliography, include the date of the first publication as follows. Fodor, Jerry A., and Gerald J. Katz. 1963, The Structure of a Semantic Theory. In the Structure of Language, edition Jerry A. Fodor and Gerald J. Katz, 479, 518, Englewood Cliffs, NJ, Prentice Hall, 1964. Citing newspapers. References to newspapers and magazines are similar to those for journals, except that it is more appropriate to put the date rather than the issue number, since it makes the source easier to find. Nascimbini, Giulio. Con l'italiano santo e navigatore è diventato bipolare. Corriere della Sera, June 25, 1976. For foreign newspapers it may be useful to specify the city, times. Citing official documents or monumental works. References to official documents require shortened forms and initialisms that vary from discipline to discipline, just as there are typical abbreviations for works on ancient manuscripts. Here your best source is the critical literature in the specific discipline you are studying. Bear in mind that certain abbreviations are commonly used within a discipline and you need not explain them to your audience. For a study on U.S. Senate resolutions, an American manual suggests the following reference. S. Res. 218, 83D Cong, 2D Session, 100 Cong Rec. 2972. Specialists are able to read this as Senate Resolution Number 218 adopted at the second session of the 83rd Congress, 1954, as recorded in Volume 100 of the Congressional Record, beginning on page 2972. Similarly, when you indicate that a text is available in PL 175. 948 in a study on medieval philosophy, anyone in the field will know that you are referring to column 948 of the 175th volume of Jacques-Paul Migny's Patrologia Latina, a classic collection of Latin texts of the Christian Middle Ages. However, if you are building a bibliography from scratch, it is not a bad idea to record on your index card the entire reference the first time you find it, because in the final bibliography it would be appropriate to give the full reference. Patrologi Cursus Completus, Series Latina, Accurant J. P. Migny. 222 volumes Paris, Garnier, 1844-1866. Citing classic works. For the citation of classic works, there are fairly universal conventions that indicate the title, book, chapter, section, paragraph, or canto line. Some works have been subdivided according to criteria dating back to antiquity, and when modern editors superimpose new subdivisions, they generally also preserve the traditional line or paragraph marks. Therefore, if you wanted to quote the definition of the principle of non-contradiction from Aristotle's Metaphysics, the reference will be met. 4.3.1005 B18. An excerpt from Charles S. Peirce's collected papers is cited as CP 2.127. A passage from the Bible is cited instead as 1 Samuel 14 verses 6 and 9. References to classical. Comedies and tragedies are comprised of act, scene, and if necessary the line or lines in Arabic numerals, shrew, 4. 2.50, 51. Naturally your reader must know that shrew refers to Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. If your thesis is on Elizabethan drama, there is no problem in using this short citation. If instead a mention of Shakespeare intervenes as an elegant and erudite digression in a psychology thesis, you should use a more extended reference. In references to classic works, the first criterion should be that of practicality and intelligibility. If I refer to a Dantean line as February 27th, 40, it is reasonable to guess that I am talking about the 40th line of the 27th canto of the second canticle of the Divine Comedy. But a Dante scholar would rather write perg. 27.40. It is best to follow disciplinary conventions. These are a second but no less important criterion. Naturally, you must pay attention to ambiguous cases. For example, references to Pascal's Pensées will differ depending on the edition from which you cite. Brunswick's popular edition is sorted differently from other editions. You can only learn these types of things by reading the critical literature on your topic. Citing unpublished works and private documents specify a thesis, a manuscript, and a private document as such. Here are two examples. La Porta, Andrea. Aspetti di una teoria dell'esecuzione nel linguaggio naturale. Laurea thesis. University of Bologna, 1975-1976. Valizio, Paolo. Novantiqua, Rhetoric as a Contemporary Linguistic Theory. Unpublished manuscript, courtesy of the author. Cite private letters and personal communications similarly. If they are of marginal importance, it is sufficient to mention them in a note, but if they are of decisive importance for your thesis, include them in the final bibliography. Smith, John, Personal Letter to Author, January 5, 1976. As we shall see in section 5.3.1, for this kind of citation it is polite to ask permission from the person who originated the personal communication and, if it is oral, to submit our transcription for his approval. Originals and translations. Ideally, you should always consult and cite a book in its original language. If you write a thesis on Molière, it would be a serious mistake to read your author in English. But in some cases, it is fine to read some books in translation. If your thesis is on Romantic literature, it is acceptable to have read The Romantic Agony, the English translation published by Oxford University Press of Mario Praz's La Carne, La Morte e il Diavolo nella Letteratura Romantica. You can cite the book in English with a good conscience, but for your reference to be useful also to those who wish to go back to the original edition, a double reference would be appropriate. The same is true if you read the book in Italian. It is correct to cite the book in Italian, but why not aid readers who wish to know if there is an English translation and, if so, who published it? Therefore, in either case, the best choice is the following. Praz, Mario. La Carne, La Morte e il Diavolo nella Letteratura Romantica. Milan and Rome, La Cultura, 1930. Transactions Angus Davidson as The Romantic Agony. Are there exceptions? Some. For example, if you cite Plato's Republic in a thesis on a topic other than ancient Greek, it is sufficient that you cite an English translation, provided that you specify the exact edition you used. Similarly, let us say your thesis deals with literary studies, and that you must cite the following book. Lotman, U. M. G. Permyakov, P. G. Bogodyrev, and V. N. Toporov. General Semiotics. Ed. Lawrence Michael O'Toole and N. Schuckman. Russian Poetics in Translation 3. Oxford, Holden Books, 1976. In this case, it is appropriate to cite only the English translation, for two good reasons. First, it is unlikely that readers interested in your topic will have the burning desire to examine the Russian original. Second, an original version of the cited book does not even exist, because the English volume is a collection of miscellaneous Russian essays from various sources put together by the editors. Therefore, you should cite after the book title, Ed. Lawrence Michael O'Toole and N. Schuckman. But if your thesis were on the current state of semiotic studies, then you would be obligated to proceed with more precision. Granted, you may not be able to read Russian, and readers can reasonably understand that you are not referring to the collection in general but instead, for example, to the first essay in the collection. And then it would be interesting to know when and where the essay was originally published, all details that the editors provide in their notes on the essay. Therefore you will cite the essay as follows. Lotman, Yuri M. The Modeling Significance of the Concepts and Beginning in Artistic Texts. In General Semiotics, edition Lawrence Michael O'Toole and N. Schuckman, 7, 11 Russian Poetics in Translation 3. Oxford, Holden Books, 1976. Originally published in Tesasy Dokladov Vyovtory Letniai Shkol Patorichnym Modelariushim Systemum, 69, 74 Tartu, 1966. This way you have not led readers to believe you have read the original text because you indicate your English source, but you have provided all the information needed to locate the original. Also, when there is no translation available for a work in a language that is not commonly known, it is customary to include a translation of the title in parentheses directly after the original title. Finally, let us examine a seemingly complicated case that at first suggests an elaborate solution, though this may be simplified depending on the context. David Efron is an Argentinian Jew who in 1941 published, in English and in the United States, a study on the gestural expressiveness of Jews and Italians in New York, called Gesture and Environment. In 1970 a Spanish translation appeared in Argentina with a different title, Gesto, Raza y Cultura. In 1972 a new edition in English appeared in the Netherlands with the title Gesture, Race and Culture. From this edition derives the 1974 Italian translation titled Gesto, Raza e Cultura. How then should an Italian student cite this book? Let us imagine two extreme cases. In the first case, the student is writing his thesis on David Efron. His final bibliography will contain a section dedicated to the author's works, in which he must create references for all the editions separately in chronological order, and for each reference, he must specify whether the book is a new edition of a previous one. We assume that the candidate has examined all the editions, because he must check whether they contain changes or omissions. In the second case, the student is writing his thesis in economics, political science, or sociology, and he is addressing the questions of emigration. In this case, he cites Efron's book only because it contains some useful information on marginal aspects of his topic. Here the student may cite only the Italian edition. But let us also discuss an intermediate case, one in which the citation is marginal, but it is important to know that the study dates back to 1941 and is not recent. The best solution would then be the following. Efron, David. Gesture and Environment. New York, King's Crown Press, 1941. Transactions Michelangelo Spada as Gesto, Raza e Cultura. As it happens, the Italian edition indicates in the copyright that King's Crown Press published the original in 1941, but rather than citing the original title, it gives the full reference to the Dutch 1972 edition. This is a matter of serious negligence, and I can say this because I am the editor of the Bompiani series in which Efron's book appeared, because an Italian student might mistakenly cite the 1941 edition as Gesture, Race, and Culture. This is why it is always necessary to check the references against more than one source. A more scrupulous student who wished to document the fortunes of Ephron's volume and the rhythm of its rediscovery by scholars might gather enough information to compile the following reference. Ephron, David. Gesture, Race and Culture. 2nd edition. The Hague, Mouton, 1972. Transactions Michelangelo Spada as Gesto, Razza e Cultura. First published as Gesture and Environment. In any case, it is evident that the extent of the required information depends on the type of thesis and the book's role in its general argument. Although the instructions above provide a foundation for creating a final bibliography for your thesis, here we are only interested in creating a good bibliographical reference in order to develop our index cards, and these instructions are more than adequate for this purpose. We will talk in more detail about the final bibliography in Chapter 6. Also, sections 5.4.2 and 5.4.3 describe two different citation systems and the relations between notes and the bibliography. There you will also find 2 full pages of a sample bibliography that essentially summarize what we have said here. Table 3.1. Summary of Documentation Guidelines. Books. 1. Last name, first name of the author or editor, with information on pseudonyms or false attributions. 2. Title, subtitle of the work. 3. Edition. 4. Volume number 5. Series. 6. Place of publication, if missing, write NP, which means no place. 7. Publisher. 8. Date of publication, if this information is missing from the book. Write ND, which means no date. 9. Trans. Journal articles. 1. Last name, first name of the author. 2. Article title. 3. Journal title. 4. Volume number, issue number. 5. 6. Inclusive page numbers. Book chapters, conference proceedings, and essays from a multi-author volume. 1. Last name, first name of the author. 2. Chapter or essay title. 3. In. 4. Title of the multi-author volume. 5. First name and last name of the editor. 6. Volume number. 7. Chapter or essays inclusive page numbers. 8. Place of publication. 9. Publisher. 10. Date of publication. Table 3.1 summarizes this section by listing all the information that your references should contain. Note the required usage of italics, quotation marks, parentheses, and punctuation. Essential information that you should never omit is marked with an asterisk. The other information is optional and depends on the type of thesis you are writing. Table 3.2. Example of a bibliographical index card. Finally, in Table 3.2 you will find an example of a bibliographical index card. As you can see, in the course of my bibliographical research I first found a citation of the Italian translation. Then I found the book in the library catalog and I marked on the top right corner the initialism for the name of the library and the call number of the volume. Finally, I located the volume and deduced from the copyright page the original title and publisher. There was no indication of the publication date, but I found one on the dust jacket flap and noted it with reservations. I then indicated why the book is worth considering. 3.2.4 An experiment in the Library of Alessandria. Some may object that the advice I have given so far may work for a specialist, but that a young person who is about to begin his thesis, and who lacks specialized expertise, may encounter many difficulties. 1. He may not have access to a well-equipped library, perhaps because he lives in a small city. 2. He may have only vague ideas of what he is looking for, and he may not know how to begin searching the subject catalog because he has not received sufficient instructions from his professor. 3. He may not be able to travel from library to library. Let us then try to imagine the extreme situation of a working Italian student who has attended the university very little during his first 3 years of study. He has had sporadic contact with only one professor, let us suppose, a professor of aesthetics or of history of Italian literature. Having started his thesis late, he has only the last academic year at his disposal. Around September he managed to approach the professor or one of the professor's assistants, but in Italy final exams take place during this period, so the discussion was very brief. The professor told him, "Why don't you write a thesis on the concept of metaphor used by Italian Baroque treatise authors?" Afterward, the student returned to his home in a town of 1,000 inhabitants, a town without a public library. The closest city is half an hour away, and it is home to a library that is open daily. With 2 half-day leaves from work, the student will travel to the library and begin to formulate his thesis, and perhaps do all the work using only the resources that he finds there. He cannot afford expensive books, and the library is not able to request microfilms from elsewhere. At best, the student will be able to travel to the university 2 or 3 times between January and April. But for the moment, he must do the best he can locally. If it is truly necessary, the student can purchase a few recent books in paperback, but he can only afford to spend about $20 on these. Now that we have imagined this hypothetical picture, I will try to put myself in this student's shoes. In fact, I am writing these very lines in a small town in southern Monferrato, 5 miles away from Alessandria, a city with 90,000 inhabitants, a public library, an art gallery, and a museum. The closest university is 1 hour away in Genoa, and in an hour and a half I can travel to Turin or Pavia, and in 3 to Bologna. This location already puts me in a privileged situation, but for this experiment I will not take advantage of the university libraries. I will work only in Alessandria. I will accept the precise challenge posed to her hypothetical student by his hypothetical professor, and research the concept of metaphor in Italian Baroque treatise writing. As I have never specifically studied this topic, I am adequately unprepared. However, I am not a complete virgin on this topic, because I do have experience with aesthetics and rhetoric. For example, I am aware of recent Italian publications on the Baroque period by Giovanni Ghetto, Luciano Anceschi, and Ezio Raimondi. I also know of Il Connocchiale Aristotelico by Emanuele Tesoro, a 17th-century treatise that discusses these concepts extensively. But at a minimum our student should have similar knowledge. By the end of the 3rd year he will have completed some relevant courses and, if he had some previous contact with the aforementioned professor, he will have read some of the professor's work in which these sources are mentioned. In any case, to make the experiment more rigorous, I will presume to know nothing of what I know. I will limit myself to my high school knowledge. I know that the Baroque has something to do with 17th century art and literature, and that the metaphor is a rhetorical figure. That's all. I choose to dedicate 3 afternoons to the preliminary research, from 3 to 6 p.m. I have a total of 9 hours at my disposal. In 9 hours I cannot read many books, but I can carry out a preliminary bibliographical investigation. In these 9 hours, I will complete all the work that is documented in the following pages. I do not intend to offer this experiment as a model of a complete and satisfactory work, but rather to illustrate the introductory research I will need to complete my final thesis. As I have outlined in section 3.2.1, upon entering the library I have 3 paths before me. 1. I can examine the subject catalog. I can look for the following entries: Italian, literature, aesthetics, 17th century, Baroque period, metaphor, rhetoric, treatise writers, and poetics. The library has two catalogs, one old and one updated, both divided by subject and author. They have not yet been merged, so I must search both. Here I might make an imprudent calculation. If I am looking for a 19th century work, I might assume that it resides in the old catalog. This is a mistake. If the library purchased the work a year ago from an antique shop, it will be in the new catalog. The only certainty is that any book published in the last 10 years will be in the new catalog. 2. I can search the reference section for encyclopedias and histories of literature. In histories of literature, I must look for the chapter on the 17th century or on the Baroque period. I can search encyclopedias for 17th century, Baroque period, metaphor, poetics, aesthetics, etc., as I would in the subject catalog. 3. I can interrogate the librarian. I discard this possibility immediately, both because it is the easiest and because it would compromise the integrity of this experiment. I do in fact know the librarian, and when I tell him what I am doing, he barrages me with a series of titles of bibliographical indexes available to him, even some in German and English. Were I not engaged in this experiment, I would immediately explore these possibilities. However, I do not take his advice into consideration. The librarian also offers me special borrowing privileges for a large number of books, but I refuse with courtesy, and from now on speak only with the assistants, attempting to adhere to the allotted time and challenges faced by my hypothetical student. I decide to start from the subject catalog. Unfortunately, I am immediately exceptionally lucky, and this threatens the integrity of the experiment. Under the entry metaphor, I find Giuseppe Conti, La Metafora Barocca. Saggio sul poetiche del Seicento. This book is essentially my thesis realized. If I were dishonest, I would simply copy it, but this would be foolish because my advisor probably also knows this book. This book will make it difficult to write a truly original thesis, because I am wasting my time if I fail to say something new and different. But if I want to write an honest literature review, this book could provide a straightforward starting point. The book is defective in that it does not have a comprehensive bibliography, but it has a thick section of notes at the end of each chapter, including not only references but also descriptions and reviews of the sources. From it I find references to roughly 50 titles, even after omitting works of contemporary aesthetics and semiotics that do not strictly relate to my topic. However, the sources I have omitted may illuminate relationships between my topic and current issues. As we shall see later, I could use them to imagine a slightly different thesis that involves the relationships between the Baroque and contemporary aesthetics. These 50 titles, all of which are specifically on the Baroque, could provide a preliminary set of index cards that I could use later to explore the author catalog. However, I decide to forego this line of research. The stroke of luck is too singular and may jeopardize the integrity of my experiment. Therefore, I proceed as if the library did not own Conti's book. To work more methodically, I decide to take the second path mentioned above. I enter the reference room and begin to explore the reference texts, specifically the Encyclopedia Treccani. Although this encyclopedia contains an entry for Baroque art that is entirely devoted to the figurative arts, there is no entry for Baroque. The reason for this absence becomes clear when I notice that the B volume was published in 1930, the reassessment of the Baroque had not yet commenced. I then think to search for Sescentismo, a term used to describe the elaborate style characteristic of 17th century European literature. For a long time, this term had a certain negative connotation, but it could have inspired the encyclopedia listing in 1930, during a period largely influenced by the philosopher Benedetto Croce's diffidence toward the Baroque period. And here I receive a welcome surprise, a thorough, extensive, and mindful entry that documents all the questions of the period, from the Italian Baroque theorists and poets such as Giambattista Marino and Emanuele Tesoro to the examples of the Baroque style in other countries, complete with excellent quotes and a juicy bibliography. I look at the date of publication, which is 1936. I look at the author's name and discover that it is Mario Praz, the best specialist during that period. Even if our hypothetical student is unaware of Praz's greatness and unique critical subtlety, he will nonetheless realize that the entry is stimulating, and he will decide to index it more thoroughly later. For now, I proceed to the bibliography and notice that this Praz, who has written such an excellent entry, has also written 2 books on the topic, Sessantismo e Marinismo in Inghilterra in 1925 and Studi sul Concertismo in 1934. I decide to index these 2 books. I then find some Italian titles by Benedetto Croce and Alessandro d'Ancona that I note. I find a reference to T.S. Eliot, and finally I run into a number of works in English and German. I note them all, even if I assume ignorance of the foreign languages. I then realize that Praz was talking about Sessantismo in general, whereas I am looking for sources centered more specifically on the Italian application of the style. Evidently I will have to keep an eye on the foreign versions as background material, but perhaps this is not the best place to begin. I return to the Treccani for the entries Poetics, Rhetoric, and Aesthetics. The first term yields nothing. It simply cross-refers to rhetoric, aesthetics, and philology. Rhetoric is treated with some breadth. There is a paragraph on the 17th century worthy of investigation, but there are no specific bibliographical directions. The philosopher Guido Calogero wrote the entry on aesthetics, but he understood it as an eminently philosophical discipline, as was common in the 1930s. There is the philosopher Giambattista Vico, but there are no Baroque treatise writers. This helps me envisage an avenue to follow. Perhaps I will find Italian material more easily in sections on literary criticism and the history of literature than in sections that deal with the history of philosophy. Nevertheless, under Calogero's entry Aesthetics, I find a series of classic histories of aesthetics that could tell me something: Arta Zimmermann, M. Schlasler, B. Bosanquet, and also G. Saintsbury, M. Menendez y Pelayo, W. Knight, and finally B. Croce. They are almost all in German and English, and very old. I should also say immediately that none of the texts I have mentioned are available in the Library of Alessandria, except Croce. I note them anyway, because sooner or later I may want to locate them, depending on the direction that my research takes. I look for the Grande Dizionario Enciclopedico UTT because I remember that it contains extensive and updated entries on poetics and various other sources that I need, but apparently the library doesn't own it. So I begin paging through the Encyclopedia Philosophica published by Sansoni. I find 2 interesting entries, one for metaphor and another for Baroque. The former does not provide any useful bibliographical direction, but it tells me that everything begins with Aristotle's theory of the metaphor. The latter provides citations of 19th and 20th century critics, B. Croce, L. Venturi, G. Ghetto, J. Rousset, L. Anseschi, E. Raimondi, that I prudently note, and that I will later re-encounter in more specialized reference works. In fact, I will later discover that this source cites a fairly important study by Italian literature scholar Rocco Montano that was absent from other sources. In most cases, because these sources preceded it. At this point, I think that it might be more productive to tackle a reference work that is both more specialized and more recent, so I look for the Storia della Letteratura Italiana, edited by the literary critics Emilio Secchi and Natalino Sapegno and published by Garzanti. In addition to chapters by various authors on poetry, prose, theater, and travel writing, I find Franco Croce's chapter Critica e Trattistica del Barocco, about 50 pages long. I limit myself to reading this particular chapter, and in fact I only skim it. I learned that the 17th century critical discussion on the Baroque begins with Alessandro Tassini, continues with a series of authors who discuss Marino's illustrious epic poem Madone, and passes through the treatise writers that Franco Croce calls moderate Baroque and through Tesoro's canonical text Il Connocchio Aristotelico, which is the foremost treatise in defense of Baroque ingenuity and wit and, according to Franco Croce, possibly the most exemplary of all Baroque manuals in all of Europe. Finally, the discussion finishes with Theletes of 18th century critics. Here I realize that my interests must center on the treatise writers Sforza Pallavicino, Peregrini, and Tesoro, and I proceed to the chapter's bibliography, which includes approximately 100 titles. It is organized by subject, and it is not in alphabetical order. My system of index cards will prove effective in putting things in order. As I've noted, Franco Croce deals with various critics, from Tassini to Fragoni, and in the end it would be advantageous to index all the references he mentions. For the central argument of my thesis, I may only need the works on the moderate critics and on Tesoro, but for the introduction or the notes it may be useful to refer to other discussions that took place during the same period. Ideally, once our hypothetical student has completed the initial bibliography, he will discuss it with his advisor at least once. The advisor should know the subject well, so he will be able to efficiently determine which sources the student should read and which others he should ignore. If the student keeps his index cards in order, he and his advisor should be able to go through them in about an hour. In any case, let us assume that this process has taken place for my experiment, and that I have decided to limit myself to the general works on the Baroque and to the specific bibliography on the treatise writers. We have already explained how to index books when a bibliographical source is missing information. On the index card for E. Raimondi reproduced below, I left space to write the author's first name, as well as the publisher's name. After the date, I left additional space for other information. I obviously added the initialism APL that I created for Alessandria Public Library after I checked for the book in Alessandria's author catalog, and I also found the call number of Ezio Raimondi's book, code D119. Table 3.3. Example of an incomplete index card from a defective bibliographical source. If I were truly writing my thesis, I would proceed the same way for all the other books. But for the sake of this experiment, I will instead proceed more quickly in the following pages, citing only authors and titles without adding other information. To summarize my work up to this point, I consulted Franco Croce's essay and the entries in the Treccani and the Encyclopaedia Philosophica, and I decided to note only the works on Italian treatises. In tables 3.4 and 3.5 you will find the list of what I noted. Let me repeat that, while I made only succinct bibliographical entries for the purpose of this experiment, the student should ideally create an index card that corresponds with each entry. Also, in each entry in tables 3.4 and 3.5, I have noted a yes before titles that exist in the author catalog of the Alessandria Library. In fact, as I finished filing these first sources, I took a break and skimmed the library's card catalog. I found many of the books in my bibliography, and I can consult them for the missing information on my index cards. As you will notice, I found 14 of the 38 works I cataloged, plus 11 additional works that I encountered by the authors I was researching. Table 3.4. General works on the Italian Baroque found in 3 reference volumes. Found in the library. Works searched for in the author catalog. Other works by the same author found in the author catalog. Yes. Croce, B. Saggi sulla letteratura italiana del Seicento. Yes. Nuovi saggi sulla letteratura italiana del Seicento. Yes. Croce, B. Storia dell'Arte Barocca in Italia. Yes. Lyrici Marinisti, Politici e Moralisti del Seicento. Found in the library. Works searched for in the author catalog. Other works by the same author found in the author catalog. D'Ancona, A. Del Sessantismo nella Poesia Cortigiana del secolo XV. Praz, M. Sessantismo e Marinismo in Inghilterra. Praz, M. Studi sul Concertismo yes. Wolflin, H. Renaissance und